Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramaddanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishno Vande Jagadgurum. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to our ongoing class on Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. We spent a number of months discussing chapter 2 of the Bhagavad Gita, all 72 verses. We are now starting on chapter 3 of the Gita. And let me give you a couple heads ups here. Our next class is on Sunday, July 21st at 9:30 a.m. So 2 weeks from now. The assignment is a little bit complicated, so please pay attention. Read verses 3.9 to 3.20 of the Gita itself, about 11 verses, and then read the first half of chapter 12 of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, which is called The Significance of Sacrifice, pages 114 to 119, only about 5 pages. And then also read Swami Tapasyananda's commentary on these verses, 3.9 to 20. And it's contained in note 4 of pages 106 to 108 of Tapasyananda's book. So I'll list all that for online participants. It'll be under the YouTube description. And answer the study questions as well, please. Okay. And so for today, the assignment was to read Sri Aurobindo's Chapter 11 of Sri Aurobindo's Essays on the Gita, called Works and Sacrifice, which concern verses 3.1 to 3.10. And we probably won't be able to get through all 10 of the verses, but we'll start going through the chapter verse by verse. Each one of these first few verses requires quite a bit of discussion and reflection. And I think you guys did a nice job in general of answering the study questions. I think the one where a number of you were a little bit confused and or uncertain was with regard to the question about Shankara's interpretation of the term naishkarmyam in 3.4. And it's partly because it was kind of a trick question. And the tricky thing about understanding and interpreting Shankara's interpretation of particular verses is his commentaries on particular verses are usually not self-contained. You can't just read that and understand what he's saying, because you have to read what he says earlier, before that verse, and then after the verse, and ideally read his commentary on the whole Gita. And even more ideally, read his Brahma Sutra Bhashya first, his commentary on the Brahma Sutra. So it's a little bit tricky. And in this case, there's really important information contained in his long introduction to chapter 3 of the Gita, framing the entire chapter, basically, by arguing that Arjuna is an inferior spiritual aspirant. And because of that, what does it mean to be inferior? It means he has an impure mind. Therefore, for Arjuna, Krishna says, you need to fight in this war. But take the desire and ego out of that work. What will happen? You'll purify your mind. And then Shankara says, what happens through purification of mind? You become eligible to practice Jnana Yoga. You get elevated to the status of a superior spiritual aspirant. And then you renounce actions. And then you realize the state of naishkarmya. We'll talk about what that means. It is kind of complicated. Okay. So let's start with the first verse, though. Please, there's an app for those of you who are new here. Otherwise, can you look along with someone else? Yeah, thanks. 3.1. So please recite after me. Arjuna uvacha.
Arjuna uvacha.
Jayasi chet.
Jayasi chet.
Karmanaste.
Karmanaste.
Mata buddhir.
Mata buddhir.
Janardana.
Janardana.
Tatkim karmani.
Tatkim karmani.
Ghore mam.
Ghore mam.
Niyojayasi.
Niyojayasi.
Keshava.
Keshava.
Let's read the second verse as well. They go together. Vyamishreneva.
Vyamishreneva.
Vakyena.
Vakyena.
Buddhim mohayasi vame. Buddhim mohayasi vame.
Buddhim mohayasi vame.
Tadekam vada.
Tadekam vada.
Nishchitya.
Nishchitya.
yena shreyoham
yena shreyoham
apnuyam.
apnuyam.
Good. Arjuna Uvacha. So this chapter begins with a question and almost an accusation from Arjuna. Krishna, why are you so confusing? You're confusing the heck out of me. Please say something clearly for my benefit, because right now I'm paralyzed with doubts and uncertainty. Hey Janardana, O Krishna, buddhi karmanaha jaisi te mata chet. If your view, your mata, is that buddhi, intelligence, is superior to karma, Tathe Keshava, mam ghore karmani kim niyojesi. Then why are you forcing me to engage in this terrible, bloody, destructive war? Why in the world are you doing that if buddhi is superior? So what okay, that's 3.1. Now, let me just also gloss 3.2. Vyamishrena iva vakyena. What you're speaking is extremely confusing. Vyamishrena eva. It's not consistent, it's not clear, it's not coherent. Me buddhi mohasi iva. You're as if bewildering me and deluding me with your confusing statements. Tat ekam nishchitya vada. Yena aham shreya apnuyam. Tell me one thing clearly, crystal clear, such that I can attain the highest. Please, O Krishna. Okay, so Arjuna is in a state of confusion, and the first study question was, what is Sri Aurobindo's understanding of why Arjuna is so confused? And personally, for all of us as readers of the Gita, we just finished chapter 2. Do we agree? Do we put ourselves in Arjuna's shoes and sympathize with him and feel, it's genuinely confusing so far. Up to chapter 2, it's not entirely clear why Arjuna should fight in this war. And you guys gave an interesting range of responses. Most of you did say, I think it's reasonable for Arjuna to be confused at this stage. Some of you said, no, it's quite clear, but I can still understand how Arjuna misinterpreted certain statements in chapter 2 of the Gita. So I wanted to mention a couple of the ways that Arjuna's confusion has been understood. Sri Aurobindo, I think, has an ingenious interpretation here. He says that the root of Arjuna's confusion can be traced to a single verse in chapter 2. Of course, it's the whole chapter, but specifically one verse, 2.49. And some of you did recognize that. I'll mention, Geeta Stevens specifically mentioned it, one of the online participants. Kiran also mentioned it without mentioning the verse number. Padma also mentioned it. And Himaja didn't mention the verse, but the idea was mentioned. What's the verse? Durena hyavaram karma buddhyoga dhananjaya. Karma is far inferior to buddhi yoga. That's the statement in 2.49 in the Gita. And what Sri Aurobindo is saying is, Arjuna has understood this statement in chapter 2 of the Gita, 2.49, to mean that Jnana yoga is superior to karma yoga. That the yoga of knowledge is superior to, so he's taking buddhi yoga to mean Jnana yoga, essentially. He's equating buddhi yoga with Jnana yoga. And then saying karma is far inferior to that. And then Arjuna is confused because then in the next breath, Krishna is saying, so therefore fight. So that's a very interesting interpretation of Arjuna's confusion. And I want you to think about that. Swami Tapasyananda has a broader understanding of Arjuna's confusion, which I think is really worth thinking about as well. And I see Tapasyananda's and Sri Aurobindo's interpretations as complementary rather than conflicting. So let me read it to you. It's on page 104, note 1 of Swami Tapasyananda's commentary. Tapasyananda says, Arjuna's doubt would probably arise in the mind of every reader of the Gita after going through the second chapter. The Lord is trying to prompt Arjuna to action as against his desire to give up an active life and become a pacifist and an ascetic. Remember chapter 1 and beginning of chapter 2, Arjuna says, I'm better off as a monk. But beyond mentioning karma yoga and offering some criticism of the Vedic ritualism, he gives no exposition of that theme, but speaks all through about the philosophy of the Atman, about control of the senses, and the self-satisfied state of a man of steady wisdom, sthita pragya. All this looks irrelevant and confusing if the object of the earlier discourse is to prompt Arjuna to action. Hence Arjuna's query. So Tapasyananda is clearly on the side of people who think that Arjuna is justified in feeling confused at this stage. Why does he say so? Let's go back briefly to chapter 2. Chapter 2, Arjuna says, I don't want to fight. I don't want to kill my own loved ones, this and that. Arjuna's first line reply is what? You can't kill anyone, nor can you be killed. Why? Because each one of us is the eternal Atman. We're eternal souls, separate from the body-mind complex. You can kill a body, but you can't kill the soul. Therefore, fight. But Tapasyananda seems to be saying there's a missing connection here. Arjuna can be saying, great, so I am a soul. I'm an eternal soul, I'm not the body, I'm not the mind. But you still haven't explained to me, Krishna, how exactly engaging in battle leads to the highest goal. I can't think of a single verse in chapter 2 which explicitly states how, through the performance of nishkama karma, desireless action, we can attain the highest goal. What you get is the famous statement, karmanyevadikaraste ma phaleshu gadachana. You should engage in action, but without coveting the fruits of the actions. That's clear. Krishna says it a couple times, right? But what's the result of that? What's the benefit of engaging in desireless action? And how does that lead us to the highest goal of moksha or realization of God or realization of self? I think I agree with Tapasyananda here. And Sri Aurobindo says the same thing in the chapter, that it's not clear yet. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, Shankara has a different way of interpreting Arjuna's confusion. Similar, but not identical. And it's very important to understand Shankara's understanding of 1 and 2, because then that also informs his interpretation of 3.3, 3.4, and so on. What he says is, Arjuna is thinking to himself, well, what I've understood from chapter 2 is Jnana is superior to karma. Maybe based on 2.49, like Sri Aurobindo says, who knows, whatever. And because again and again, Krishna is saying, realize the self, realize the self, realize the self, right? In that sense. And then Arjuna is wondering, well, if that's the case, if I need to realize a self, if that's my highest priority, why in the world should I engage in a bloody battle? Okay. And Shankara says the answer that Krishna is going to give, starting in 3.3, can any of you guess how Shankara understands Krishna's answer to Arjuna's question? How would Shankara respond? Why is he encouraging Arjuna to fight if the goal is to realize the self?
It's a purification.
Yeah. In simple words, Krishna's answer is because you are an inferior spiritual aspirant. You are not ready for Jnana Yoga. You have an impure mind. Therefore, practice Karma Yoga, purify your mind, then become eligible for Jnana Yoga, then renounce actions, then practice Jnana Yoga exclusively, and then you realize the highest goal. This is an overarching way of understanding Shankara's interpretation of basically the whole Gita, in fact. That's why it's really important to keep that in mind. Okay, so now we have 3 different understandings of Arjuna's confusion. We have Shankara's, which already brings in this distinction between inferior spiritual aspirants and superior spiritual aspirants. And Arjuna falls on the side of the inferior spiritual aspirant. Second is Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. I think Sri Aurobindo and Tapasyananda basically are in agreement here. But that unlike Tapasyananda, Sri Aurobindo points to a particular verse which leads to the acutest confusion in Arjuna's mind, which is 2.49. Because Arjuna misunderstands Buddhi Yoga to mean Jnana Yoga. And as Ellis and several others pointed out, if you understand that verse correctly, especially through the lens of Sri Aurobindo, what you'll find is Buddhi Yoga there just means Karma Yoga. So what 2.49 actually says is that karma is far inferior to karma yoga. You see. But one can easily misunderstand Buddhi Yoga. And now, what's one thing that supports Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of this? And linking these 3.1 and 2 to 2.49? The word buddhi. In 3.1, jayasi chet karmanaste mata buddhihi janardana. Arjuna's not saying jnana. He's saying, if you just told me that buddhi is superior to karma, then why are you telling me to fight in this war? So Sri Aurobindo is saying, look at the word buddhi here. It's a clue that he's thinking of 2.49, where the word buddhi yoga is used. You see what I mean? This is how Sri Aurobindo always tries to anchor his interpretations in the specifics of the verses. That's one of the virtues, I think, of his interpretations. Okay, so any questions about 1 and 2 before we move on to 3.3? No? Good. Please repeat after me. Now this is the beginning of Krishna's reply to Arjuna. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha
Shri Bhagavan Vacha
Lokesmin
Lokesmin
Dvividha Nishtha
Dvividha Nishtha
Pura Prokta
Pura Prokta
Mayanagha
Mayanagha
Jnana Yogena
Jnana Yogena
Sankhyanam
Sankhyanam
Karma Yogena
Karma Yogena
Yoginam.
Yoginam.
Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, Krishna said, Hey Anagha, O stainless one, Arjuna, Asmin Loke, in this world, Dvividha Nishtha Maya Pura Prokta. In the past, I spoke of 2 main paths. Nishtha, like, actually it literally means like dedication or devotion to a particular spiritual practice. Sankhyanam Jnana Yogena. To the Sankhyas, Sankhyins, for the Sankhyins, I taught Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. And Yoginam, for the yogis, I taught what? Karma Yoga, Karma Yogena. It's a really interesting verse, actually. This is how Krishna begins to try to clarify or resolve Arjuna's confusion. Okay, by saying that I taught 2 different paths. And later we'll find in chapter 4 at the very beginning, Krishna says, he's implying that it's Karma Yoga. Gita is not the first scripture to teach Karma Yoga. It actually, what Krishna is saying is, it was taught in ancient times, but that knowledge has been lost, that wisdom has been lost. And now, the commonly accepted view in India, now meaning at that time that Krishna was speaking to Arjuna, the view is to make spiritual progress and to attain the highest goal of liberation, realization of self, you have to renounce actions. But much earlier, in the past, Krishna, as God, did teach another path, Karma Yoga, where arguably, it depends on your interpretation, you can attain the highest just through Karma Yoga as well. But that wisdom has been lost. Can anyone of you think of an Upanishad? Some of the Upanishads themselves, they belong to different strata, different ages, but one of the oldest Upanishads contains a hint of this doctrine of Karma Yoga in the Bhagavad Gita. Any guesses? Very good. Isha Upanishad. Which mantra? Do you remember? No. Second mantra. Kurvan neveha karmani jijivichet shatagga samaha. One should strive to live 100 years continuously working, kurvan neveha karmani, continually performing actions. So many scholars think that this verse, the second mantra of the Isha Upanishad, contains in seed, in germ, the whole Karma Yoga teaching of the Bhagavad Gita, which comes obviously centuries after the Isha Upanishad. But that's just one clue as to some ancient texts, scriptures that taught this doctrine of Karma Yoga. Okay. Now again, I think it's useful to start with Shankara's commentary here. Shankara does something, so please look at the board now. Okay. I've already explained this, which is Shankara's, now look, Shankara here. What he's doing is, let's look at Shankara first, before Sri Aurobindo. He's focusing on the second line, okay, and he has a field day with it. Jnana Yogena Sankhyanam Karma Yogena Yoginam. He says, see, Krishna is saying, I teach Jnana Yoga to Sankhyans, and I teach Karma Yoga to yogis. He's saying, Krishna is all but saying that I'm teaching these different paths to different levels of spiritual aspirant. Sankhyans are the Uttama Adhikaris, the superior spiritual aspirants who have very pure minds, who are eligible for renunciation of actions and the performance of Jnana Yoga alone. And Krishna taught a completely different path called Karma Yoga for who? Inferior aspirants, which he calls the yogis. They're meant for different people. Different strokes for different folks. You see? And so Shankara says, he builds a strong, or arguably a strong case, based not just on this verse, but he thinks this is one of the verses that supports the view that Krishna is drawing a distinction between 2 levels of adhikari, spiritual aspirant. Okay? and that Karma Yoga is meant for inferior spiritual aspirants, Jnana Yoga is meant for superior spiritual aspirants. Now, one question that we can ask is, how plausible do we find that reading of this verse? Do you have thoughts on that? This is not a study question. I'm just raising it right now.
Not that plausible, because he doesn't make that distinction, at least in the verse. He basically just says, I taught different paths, but he doesn't say anything about
higher and lower, right? Inferior and superior. Right. Okay. So yeah, I think that's good. So what Ellis just said is basically the opinion of both Sri Aurobindo and Swami Tapasyananda, which is that yes, Krishna did teach these two different paths to people of different temperaments, different kinds of people. Just as Sri Ramakrishna used to say, a mother will cook the same fish but in many different ways for her different children. For a 6-month-old baby versus a 5-year-old versus a teenager, she might make fish soup for somebody with weak digestion. But does that mean that one is superior to the other? Not necessarily. And Sri Aurobindo and Tapasyananda will say no. So let me read you now a little bit of Tapasyananda's commentary on verse 3.3. This is on pages 104 to 105 of Tapasyananda's commentary. He says, much confusing controversy will be found in the writings of Vedantic Acharyas in the interpretation of this passage because of the difference in their basic views on the relation between action and pure contemplation, karma and jnana. Two views are held on this question. I think Tapasyananda does a nice job of clearly explaining this. What are the views? One is yoga, that work and contemplation should be combined all through one's spiritual life. Karma yoga plus jnana yoga, all throughout. From the very beginning, you can do it. Ramanuja also believes this. The other is Sankhya, maintaining that action with devotional contemplation is applicable only up to a certain stage. That is, till the aspirant gains chitta shuddhi, or purity of mind, which in practical life means the capacity to check the outward-going tendency of the mind. Karma yoga has no relevance afterwards, and one should take to the life of a pure contemplative philosopher at that stage. The main reason given for this idea is that works of every kind go to emphasize the reality of multiplicity and the ego, whereas the pure contemplative's discipline consists in the denial of these, and so at one stage, work has to be abandoned. And before I go on, this is one of Shankara's, if you study Shankara's commentaries at all in Sanskrit, one of the formulas that comes up very frequently is the following. Shankara says, avidya kama karma. Avidya kama karma. Memorize it. It's short and easy. Avidya means ignorance. Kama means what?
Desire.
Karma means action in this context. This is it. Shankara explains why action has to be renounced after a certain stage. He says that ignorance is the root problem. Ignorance of what? Of Brahman. Of our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. Because we are not aware of ourselves as Brahman and we think that we're body-mind complex, what happens? We have desires. As a result of desires, we act. What sense does it make to act if we don't have a desire to do something or accomplish something? This is the logic. Okay? After a certain stage, when we purify our minds and get rid of the desires in our mind, we won't have the motivation to act anymore. And at a higher level, Shankara says, you can only act so long as you have a sense of doership. But when you've renounced the very sense that you are a doer, what sense does it make to act anymore? So at a certain stage of evolution in spiritual life, when you have moved beyond the idea that you are the doer, where you have gone beyond having worldly desires, you should give up actions. At least karmendriya, actions involving the karmendriyas, the organs of action like hands and feet, because of course, shravana, manana, nididhyasana is the main practice of jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, which means you listen to the Mahavakyas, thou art that Brahman, I am Brahman, aham brahmasmi. You reflect on those teachings, you meditate on those teachings. All of that is mental practice, right? And in a sense, that is karma. But what Shankara has in mind is you stop, performing charity, doing puja, coming to classes, and so on and so forth. That's the idea. Stuff that involves hands and feet and eyes and the sense organs. Okay. So that's the basic logic behind Shankara's position here. Now, then Tapasyananda says, interestingly, in favor of Shankara, at least provisionally. He says, there is a clear support for this interpretation in the Gita passage. And then he quotes, this is from 6.3. For one desiring to attain to the state of equipoise, yoga, work is the means. But for one who has attained equipoise, yoga rura stadochyate, quietude, shama, is the means. We'll get to this when we get to chapter 6. It's a very interesting verse. What Krishna seems to say is, at a certain point, once you have ascended to the standpoint of yoga, then shamaha, tranquility, should be the main practice, and not karma, not action. Now, how you interpret action, and maybe that's not necessarily, Krishna may not be ruling out karma yoga, that depends on interpretation. But Tapasyananda is saying, look, there are certain verses which can be read as supporting Shankara's understanding of karma yoga for lower spiritual aspirants and jnana yoga for higher ones. He mentions another verse. He says, again, and this is from chapter 3, that comes up 3.17, a little bit later. 3.17 says, but the man whose delight is in the self alone, who is content with the self, who is satisfied with the self, for him there exists no work that needs be done as duty. So again, Shankara will be saying, see, for superior spiritual aspirants, no work needs to be done. So for somebody who's content in the Atman, no sense of doership. Okay, so we should be very careful when we're interpreting Shankara's and discussing Shankara's interpretation. He's reading the Gita as a whole, just as Aurobindo is doing. And so even though here in this particular verse, you may not be convinced by Shankara's interpretation, and you might be saying, well, he seems to be reading in this inferior, superior kind of thing into Sankhyanam and Yoginam. I would say withhold judgment until you read the entire Gita and see what other verses Shankara brings into play to support his interpretation. Does that make sense? Okay. But Tapasyananda does strongly disagree with Shankara here, ultimately. He says in the next paragraph, Tapasyananda, the Gita is equally clear in the passage under discussion, 3.3, that these two paths are distinct paths and each independently takes one to a goal that is common to both. Both are direct paths, karma yoga and jnana yoga. What does this remind us of for people who are in our tradition? Swami Vivekananda says it all the time. Each of the four yogas are direct and independent paths to moksha. No higher and lower. And Tapasyananda rightly, and very much in line with Sri Aurobindo, both of them say the same thing. They say that you have to, Krishna will bring up Jnana yoga and karma yoga again in chapter 5 in the beginning. And there, Krishna very explicitly states that karma yoga and Sankhya yoga take us to the same goal, but just through different paths. And there doesn't seem to be a suggestion that karma yoga is just a preliminary discipline that makes you eligible to practice jnana yoga. They independently take you to the highest goal. In fact, Swami Vivekananda himself points to this verse 5.5, not 3.3, but 5.5. Yat sankhyahi prapte sthanam tad yogairapi gamite. Yeah. Okay. He says this verse in the Gita proves that karma yoga and jnana yoga are on an equal footing and that they can lead directly to the same goal of liberation. Okay? Okay. So now, Tapasyananda, I think this is very much in line with Sri Aurobindo and in line with Sri Ramakrishna. He says, in the light of the general teaching of the Gita, the followers of the two ways, karma yoga and jnana yoga, may be held as two distinct types. The one discarding the combination at a certain stage, karma yoga plus jnana yoga, and the other continuing the combination till the end. The former, called in the Gita as the Sankhyas, following the path of knowledge, abandon all actions at the very start itself if they are qualified for it, or at a certain later stage after being purified by yoga discipline, when they take to a purely contemplative life. Through that discipline, they come to the recognition of all multiplicity as mere appearance and realize the unity of all existence in Brahman. The latter, called the yogins, the karma yogis, pursuing the path of combining devotion, contemplation, and dedicated action, bhakti yoga, dhyana yoga, meditation, and karma yoga, dedicated action, surrender the fruits of all their actions in the first stage of spiritual life, and finally surrender their sense of agency also to that universal will, Ishvara, whose expression the world of multiplicity is. They also attain to the divine. This is interesting because Tapasyananda will agree with Shankara that at a certain stage in spiritual life, we give up the sense of doership. Shankara says, therefore we should stop acting. The moment we lose doership, it doesn't make much sense to act. Sri Aurobindo will say, like Sri Ramakrishna, Ami jontro tumi jontri. The bhakti position is, I'm a mere instrument in the hands of God. I am not the doer because God is a doer. And God continues to work through me, using me as his or her instrument. So at the level of body-mind, the action will go on, even after we lose the sense of doership. Does that make sense? So for Sri Aurobindo, for Swami Tapasyananda, for Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji, I think, Karma Yoga is a spiritual practice, a very powerful spiritual practice that can and should be performed at all stages in spiritual life, from the very beginning, in combination with Bhakti Yoga and with Jnana Yoga, in fact. Shankara, another one of these famous Sanskrit formulas that he talks about a lot, he rejects this doctrine. It's called the doctrine of Jnana Karma Samuchaya. Samuchaya means combination. Shankara, during Shankara's time, one of the prevailing doctrines was that you can and should combine the path of knowledge with the path of karma. Ramanuja believed it, but of course he came after Shankara. But there are traditions that taught this. There's actually, before Advaita Vedanta, a more ancient school of Vedanta is called Bheda Vedanta, and they taught Jnana Karma Samuchaya. Bhartri Prapancha is one of the main early Bheda Vedans, which Shankara explicitly names. He explicitly names them in his commentary in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Shankara says, not possible. You should never combine the path of knowledge with the path of karma. What's the logic? Because they're meant for different stages of spiritual aspect. You can't be in 5th grade and doing a PhD at the same time. That's the logic. Does that make sense?
No.
Okay. Well, why not?
It's dualism. It's a false paradigm. It's flawed from the very beginning. That the idea that you can separate those two ever is nonsense.
Okay.
From my point of view.
It's a bold view from Anthony. Thank you. Yeah. So intelligent people can disagree about these things. Just I want you to think for yourselves about what you think is most plausible about it. What's the more plausible view? And specifically, our aim here is to understand what is the view of the Gita. Okay, and we should ask ourselves to what extent Shankara is reading his own views into the scripture, and we should ask the same question about other commentators like Tapasyananda and Sri Aurobindo. Okay, and so Sri Aurobindo says, very much like Tapasyananda and like Sri Ramakrishna, Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga are meant for just different temperaments. Sankhyans are people who are kind of more contemplative in nature, and they think that in spiritual life, the further you evolve, the less you're going to act in the world. There's just a certain kind of basic spiritual intuition there that they have. So you perform actions at a preliminary stage. Ultimately, though, you feel called to renounce actions, and then you practice the path of knowledge exclusively, and then you attain liberation. There's just a certain kind of person who believes in that way. And Krishna says that's a perfectly valid path. But don't generalize it and say that everybody has to accept that framework, basically. And Karma Yoga, on Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, is the following. You perform nishkama karma, desireless action, egoless action, throughout, beginning, middle, and end. It can take you all the way to liberation. Even Jivan Muktas, the one who has attained liberation, can continue to work in the world. We'll see this in chapter 18. Sarva karmani apisada, even after realizing the highest, you continue to perform all actions, like Isha Upanishad says in the second mantra. So that's Sri Aurobindo's view. Okay? So think about it for yourselves. And we will move on to 3.4.
If you're still attached to the ego,
Yeah.
how can you perform true nishkama karma? Unless
Very good.
You have jnana coming
Yeah,
through
this is a very,
jnana.
right, exactly. Well, that's part of Arjuna's confusion in a way. And I think that chapter 3, there's a beautiful verse, one of my favorites, which begins to answer the question. It's it's Mayi Sarvani Karmani Sanyasya Adhyatma Chetasa. There it is, 2.30, 3.30. We don't have to go there now. But basically the idea is, whatever you do it for me, as an offering to me. And try to take the ego out of that. Nirashi nirmamo bhutva yudhyasva vigatajvaraha. And by doing that, you will make spiritual progress, purify the mind. And I think the practical side of your question is this, or the answer to the practical side of your question is this. It's not an all or nothing thing. It's not, we either perform an action with 100% ego or 0% ego. That's just not the way that spiritual life works. There's always going to be a mixture. And in the early stages of spiritual life, when we take the Karma Yoga, it might be 80% ego, 20% offering and thinking of God and offering it to the divine. as you progress in spiritual life, as you continue to engage in karma yoga and exercise vichara, which means, be mindful, reflect, inspect your own motives behind doing things. I'm telling myself and others that I'm doing this as karma yoga, but then wait a minute, why am I so distraught when I failed in my task? Or when I didn't get the promotion I wanted? Or I didn't, do you see what I mean? So if you're a sincere spiritual aspirant, you'll be testing yourself, checking in with yourself once in a while. And at a certain stage, after the sincere practice of karma yoga, the percentage might change a little bit. It might be 60% ego, 40% egolessness, more doing things as a seva to Bhagavan, to God. So that's the way I see it, is that just because we can't completely eliminate ego from the beginning doesn't mean we shouldn't engage in karma yoga. Otherwise, no spiritual practice will get off the ground. Yeah.
Is it possible that jnana karma samuchaya is risky? Because if you misunderstand jnana, then it can justify all sorts of actions, right? Like in the gospel, right, when the Swami's saying, like, oh, I'm having an affair, how could that be the only real thing?
Right. No, that's good. Yeah. And that's a big thing now with this, what's called neo-Advaita, which are people who drop the kind of eligibility requirements for practicing Advaita Vedanta and think all you have to do is tell yourself that you are the Atman and you can go on in this world doing whatever you want, because this world is unreal after all. So it doesn't really matter. So that is a danger. But one thing we have to keep in mind is, what exactly does jnana mean? And it doesn't necessarily mean Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, this kind of... Can somebody shut the door? If you don't, yeah, thank you. It could just mean... See, even if you look at the Gita, and the way that, especially one of the verses that we talked about for the study questions, it was verse 3.6. Meditation, right, is talked about. That falls under Jnana Yoga. That's also included in Jnana Yoga. It means sitting still, shutting your eyes, sitting in some kind of posture and thinking of some higher spiritual reality. That's also part of Jnana Yoga. That's not strictly Shankara's Jnana Yoga, actually. And so the way that Gita understands Jnana Yoga seems to be broader than just Shankara's understanding of Jnana Yoga. Does that make sense? It's about contemplative spiritual practice. Yeah. Okay. So, 3.4, please repeat after me. Nakarmanam anarambhan naishkarmyam purushošnute nacha sanyasanad eva siddhim samadhigacchati. Purushaha, a person, karmanam anarambhat naishkarmyam na ashnute. A person can never attain the state of naishkarmya. We'll talk about what that term means. That's the million-dollar question. Karmanam anarambhat, by simply refraining from performing actions. Nacha sanyasanat eva, through sannyasa, renunciation of actions, siddhim samadhigacchati. Nobody just through renunciation of actions has attained the highest spiritual perfection. That's just not the way spiritual life works. He's telling Arjuna, who's saying, better for me to be a sannyasi than to fight in this bloody battle. He's saying, it's not that easy, my friend. Just by not fighting in the battle, you're not going to attain perfection by sitting still and doing nothing. Okay? So again, the apparent meaning is very simple, but there's a lot of complexity here. There are different ways of interpreting this. Let's start again with Shankara, keeping in mind the overall thrust of his interpretation of the preceding verses. Shankara says the following. And to understand this, to understand Shankara's commentary, you should have read the way he introduces this verse. So let me read it to you. 3.4. He says, well, okay, I'm not going to read it because it'll take too long. Okay, but let me explain it quickly. Okay. He says the following. Yes, what does Krishna mean? He means just by stopping actions, by not acting, you can never attain naishkarmya. Now we get to my complicated attempt to diagram Shankara's interpretation of this verse. Okay, here's how I see it. He says, here's the way to perfection. First, perform karma yoga, assuming you have an impure mind. You're an inferior spiritual aspirant like Arjuna. What happens? You purify your mind. Then you eventually attain steadfastness in Jnana Yoga. A lot of you had trouble understanding exactly what Shankara means by Naishkarmya, and I think there's a legitimate, just as Arjuna's confusion is justified, I think your confusion is also justified. The reason being that I think Shankara, and I think that Shankara's commentary is sometimes open to interpretation. And here's one of these cases. I think he interprets Naishkarmya, the term Naishkarmya, in two subtly different ways. The first way he interprets Naishkarmya is the state of being free from action, and the original Sanskrit that he uses is karma shunyata. Karma shunyata. Being completely devoid of action. Okay, not engaging in actions. When you purify your mind and become eligible to practice Jnana Yoga, you should stop performing actions. So I think this is sense one. Maybe we can say this is, I should add subscript 1 here. And then subscript 2 will be here. Once we become an Uttama Adhikari, a superior spiritual aspirant, we perform Jnana Yoga alone, and we attain this first kind of Naishkarmya, which is we're no longer engaging in actions, physical actions, okay, with our hands, our feet, and whatever. Karma shunyata. What's the result of that if we practice Jnana Yoga sincerely? Realization of the actionless self. And Himajan, a number of you recognize that that's the primary understanding, Shankara, or at least another understanding of Naishkarmya. Shankara understands Naishkarmya to mean the self, the capital S self. It doesn't act. It's completely transcendental. And when you realize that self, that is a state of Naishkarmya. I think that Shankara is playing on the word Naishkarmya here, and that he means both things by the term Naishkarmya. It means at the stage of Jnana Yoga, you cease from acting in the world. Ultimately, the result is realizing yourself as the actionless, non-dual self, Atman. Okay? And that, the Sanskrit he uses for the second sense of Naishkarmyam is Niskriyatma Swarupena Avasthanam. Avasthanam means residing in, or being in the state of what? Niskriyatma Swarupa. Your true essence as the Nishkriya, the non-active Atman. As the actionless self. And that is tantamount to liberation. If you realize the self, that's liberation for Shankara. Does that make sense? That's my suggestion. I'm not going to claim that everyone would agree with this understanding of Shankara. But it's genuinely tricky. And I think that Shankara has both meanings of Naishkarmya in mind. Yeah.
Concisely, can you go over it again? What is interpretation 1 and what is interpretation 2? Because you said they're different.
Naishkarmya 1 means I'm no longer acting in the world.
Okay.
Naishkarmya 2, and Naishkarmya 1 means I'm not acting in the world and I'm practicing Jnana Yoga exclusively. Naishkarmya 2 is the result of that practice of Jnana Yoga exclusively. What is that? Realizing the self, which is actionless. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Now, Swami Tapasyananda, again, I think, has an illuminating interpretation here. It's a long commentary. I'm only going to read the first part of it. Tapasyananda says, Naishkarmya is not mere worklessness, external passivity or idleness. It is a state of establishment in the experience that one is the Atman, the pure spirit, the uninvolved witness of passivity as well as of activity of the body-mind. Willful worklessness, which is tantamount to idleness, is not the aim. This is his interpretation of 3.4. I think it's very much in line with Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. Right? I think that's pretty plausible. Sri Aurobindo says, in contrast to Shankara, Naishkarmya, he says, is a calm voidness from works. Right? Did I write that down? No, right? Oh, okay, sorry. There's just not enough room on the board. But that doesn't mean that, but he doesn't accept the Naishkarmya 1 interpretation of Shankara. That it means karma shunyata, that you stop acting in the world. You continue to act at the level of body-mind while still identifying with your true spiritual nature as the Atman. And then eventually the Gita will add this third doctrine of the Purushottama in chapter 15. When you identify with the Purushottama and realize that you're an instrument of the Purushottama, of course you'll continue to act at the level of body-mind as an instrument of the divine. But you still are one with, you mentally, at the level of consciousness, you're identified with your divine nature. That's the idea. Okay. Okay, any questions about this before we move on to 5 and 6? I want to end with 5 and 6. Yeah.
So I have a question back.
Yes.
Reference to Buddhi Yoga in chapter 2.
Buddhi Yoga. Yeah.
I mean, it's briefly, Sri Krishna talks about it, but it's not kind of brought back in these discussions as much. And different commentators seems to interpret like
Buddhi Yoga in different ways.
Jnana Yoga or Bhakti Yoga.
Yeah.
So can you elaborate more on why Sri Krishna doesn't really refer to that word as much as Karma Yoga?
Buddhi Yoga.
In the later...
I mean, why Krishna does it is only Lord... I can say the Lord knows. Krishna knows. God knows. But remember there are a few verses in chapter 2 where the word buddhi comes up again and again.
Yeah.
That's a kind of keynote, the word buddhi. And Krishna is clearly interpreting it in this very new way via Karma Yoga. You know what I mean? And that's what he's doing in those verses. He's giving a new interpretation of buddhi. Traditionally, it's associated with what? Jnana Yoga, intelligence, right? Which seems to be incompatible with action. He's giving it a new twist in those verses. But the thing you have to keep in mind about the Gita is that it'll use different terms to refer to the same thing. The term Karma Yoga, the term Buddhi Yoga, sometimes just the term yoga itself. In some contexts, it just means Karma Yoga. So they're synonyms.
Yeah,
so if you're asking,
what is a little confusing
yeah,
for me.
There are a lot of things that one can be confused, and it also, as I said, this gives commentators a lot of scope to interpret these same terms in very different ways. Like they're given that leeway because they're using terms like buddhi. Shankara will say that's jnana yoga. You know what I mean? That's just the nature of the text. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but good question. Okay, so 5. Let's look at 5. I actually want to get to 7 if possible, but okay. Nahi kaschit kshanamapi jatu tishtati akarmakrit karyate hyavashah karma sarvaha prakriti jai gunaihi. Okay. Na kaschit, no one, absolutely no one. This is important, the na kaschit, because that also is kind of interpreted differently by different commentators. Jatu, ever, at any time, kshanamapi, not even for a moment, akarmakrit tishtati, can anyone not act? It's a very interesting statement. Not for one moment can anyone not act, cease from acting. You might think, well, if I just sit still, isn't that not acting? No. He sarvaha prakriti jaihi gunaihi avashah karma karyate. The gunas of nature, sattva, karma, and sattva, rajas, and tamas, will make you act. Even if you don't want to act, it will force you. Swamiji didn't want to go to the West and preach. And what did Ramakrishna say? Your very bones will make you work. Your very bones. Okay. I'm going to start with Shankara again, just so that we have that in play before we talk about Sri Aurobindo. What does Shankara say? Very interesting. He says, the word for the unenlightened is implied, but it's not explicitly stated in this verse. Okay, he's saying this verse, 3.5, only applies to unenlightened people, to ajñas, that's the Sanskrit term used, those who are who think of themselves as body minds. So Arjuna, people like Arjuna who are inferior spiritual aspirants, they are the ones who can never stop from acting. By contrast, both Tapasyananda and Sri Aurobindo say, where's the justification for thinking that this verse applies only to ignorant people? Because the language here is nahi kaschit. Kaschit means absolutely no one. So again, from the standpoint of Sri Aurobindo and Swami Tapasyananda, the idea is, Krishna's not saying that it's only the unenlightened, the ignorant people, manda adhikaris, inferior aspirants like Arjuna, can't cease from acting. He's making a very general statement that literally nobody can cease from acting. And what's the logic behind it? Body and mind. There's action at the level of body, but there's also, when you stop, when literally the body is completely motionless, you can still be acting. How? At the mental level. Thinking a thought is karma. Sri Ramakrishna says this at one place in the gospel. I couldn't find it. I was looking for the passage, but it's there. All mental spiritual practice is also karma. And this is a beautiful segue into verses 6 and 7, right? Which is Krishna saying to Arjuna, go ahead and try. Go ahead and try to just stop acting, and let's see how you fare. Okay. Karmendriyani. Sanyamya
Sanyamya
Yaaste
Yaste
Manasa Smaran
Manasa Smaran
Indriyarthan
Indriyarthan
Vimudhatma
Vimudhatma
Mithyacharaha
Mithyacharaha
Sa Uchyate.
Sa Uchyate.
Yaha, the person who karma indriyani sanyamya, the person who restrains, stops his karma indriyas, the organs of action, hands, feet, right, the things that we do to engage in physical actions in this world. Even reading a book requires that I flip the pages with my hand and so on and so forth. Okay, imagine I'm the person and I completely stock still like this, shutting my eyes. Manasa indriyarthan smaran aste. Sitting there, manasa indriyarthan, but the mind is dwelling on sense objects. The very things that are in the external world that I'm pretending to be above and beyond and detached from. Saha vimudhatma. That person is completely deluded. Mithyachara. So this is very strong language. Sometimes Krishna uses strong language. This is one of those places. Harsh language. Mithyachara. And in fact, there are different interpretations of the word mithyachara. Most seem to interpret it to mean a hypocrite. Going back to Dinesh's question about the danger of self-deception or hypocrisy in spiritual life, people who just don't have sufficiently pure minds to sit still for 18 hours and think of God or the self, but who try to, are going to fall flat on their face and end up deceiving themselves. Either going crazy, that sometimes happens. You become mentally unbalanced. Or you deceive yourself, you become a big guru, and yet there's no inner transformation. People might even worship you and bow down to you, but it's fruitless. Now, is Krishna saying, so therefore don't meditate? No. He's saying, for the vast majority of spiritual aspirants, you should meditate. The whole chapter 6 of the Gita is devoted to dhyana yoga, atma sanyama yoga. But do it in combination with karma yoga, a bhakti-oriented karma yoga. Don't think that you are ready to just spend 18 or 20 hours in pure contemplation. You're going to fall flat on your face if you do that. Does that make sense? So there's a really interesting study question. I got interesting responses to this study question about how you guys see verses 6 and 7 as applying to your spiritual life. So let me read you the verse 7 and then we'll talk about them together. Yastvindriyani manasa niyamya arabate juna karmendriyaihi karma yogam asaktaha savishishyate. Oh Arjuna, hey Arjuna, yahatu manasa indriyani niyami. He's saying this is the better course for the vast majority of spiritual aspirants. That person who, using the mind, is able to indriyani niyamya, controls the sense organs, the organs of action even, but with the intelligence, the buddhi that Bala was asking about. Asaktaha karma indriyaihi karma yogam arabate, and engages in karma yoga, in physical actions in the world, but as karma yoga. Not just as karma. There's a world of difference between karma and karma yoga. This is karma yoga, which means not coveting the fruits of the work, not being too attached to the fruits, to the work itself even. And Krishna will soon go on to add a few verses later, and doing it as an offering to the divine, doing it for God. Okay, what happens then? Asaktaha, that person is unattached. And saha vishishyate, that person excels. So Krishna says, don't think that you only make spiritual progress by shutting your eyes, sitting in the meditation room. No. That's good. But that should always be done in conjunction with karma yoga. And karma yoga, you should never think that karma yoga is just a kind of inferior discipline. How is that going to help me? No, that can take you to the highest. And Swamiji would always encourage us to combine all four of the yogas in our day-to-day life. That's why the emblem of the Ramakrishna mission is, you know the whole thing, right? Wavy waters and combination of the four yogas. The scriptural text that arguably most clearly supports this doctrine of the combination of the four yogas is the Bhagavad Gita. But it doesn't all come at once. Bhakti yoga is not playing a prominent role yet. You get that tiny little hint in chapter 2, matparaha. That's it. The only hint of bhakti in chapter 2. Chapter 3, you get a little bit more bhakti. Chapter 12 is called Bhakti Yoga and it's full-blown bhakti. And chapter 18, it's all bhakti all the time. So it's like a narrative, you know? Krishna doesn't want to... spoil all this. There's a little suspense in this, and you have to put the time in to read all 700 verses to really appreciate the arc of the whole Gita. It's very beautiful, actually, the way it unfolds. It's very poetic and very powerful. So now, some of you, I want to read out, and because it's a little personal, I won't mention the people's names, but just some of the things that some of you said in response to this question about how verses 3.6 to 7 are relevant to your spiritual life and day-to-day spiritual practice. So one person says, these verses remind me that I'm a hypocrite nearly every time I sit and close my eyes for meditation. They remind me that the real battle, striving for real renunciation, is not about ridding oneself of mere material attachments. They remind me of the story of two friends, one going to the temple, the other going to enjoy a night out, partying, but each wanting what the other chose, and so on. Someone else. When I close my eyes and sit in a quiet room to meditate, the mind does not come under control easily or stay that way for long. I still run to-do lists and process events with my mind, even while my senses are withdrawn. I would like to think I'm not a hypocrite because I acknowledge that the mind is not under control and I'm on this journey of several lifetimes. Smiley face emoji. So that's a nice attitude. I mean, I think one thing is we shouldn't beat ourselves up if everybody has trouble meditating. A lot of you are initiated. The first thing the Guru will say is, it doesn't matter how restless your mind is. Sit still and follow my instructions and repeat the mantra for a certain amount of time, at least, a certain minimum, regardless of whether the mind wanders. And eventually, if you're sincere, you'll be able to bring the mind under control. Okay? And so, mityachara, we can be generous to ourselves and not always, you shouldn't feel guilty about the fact that your mind is wandering. The whole fact that, first of all, that you're aware of the fact that your mind is wandering is itself a huge step in the right direction. And then secondly, trying to bring the mind back to the spiritual reality, whether you're meditating on the self or God. Yeah? And so I think verse 6, for instance, of course it is condemning hypocrites, but I think it also is very helpful as a kind of check, a test for each of us. When you sit for meditation, just be mindful and ask yourself, where does your mind drift? Where does your mind go? And depending on the answer, you'll be able to understand where your strongest attachments are. It's a very practical tip. Just think about it. And Swamiji in Raja Yoga, Swami Vivekananda says the same thing. Before you actually engage in your daily spiritual practices of meditation, let the mind run on and observe it. Just watch it. And see where it goes. The mind, think of God. Where else will we think about it? Slowly, suddenly it drifts toward why. The letter Y. It's a variable. What is that why? Each of us will have a different why. And once you identify that, you can then try to, first of all, ask yourself, why are you so strongly attached to that X or Y? And then, how do I reduce my attachment? Pray to God to reduce the attachment. So I see this as very practical in that way also. That's something that I would add. But let me read to you a couple more of your answers. Another person says, 3.6 provides a guideline for avoiding spiritual self-deception and a guidepost for measuring spiritual progress. This verse makes it clear that true internal renunciation is more important than an unintegrated, outward-only self-discipline. Verse 3.7 makes it clear that sense control and detachment start with the mind, and that through karma yoga, I can live in the world and still make spiritual progress. I think that's also really helpful, and that really can apply to all of us. Another person says, these verses make it clear how one can progress better in spiritual life by performing actions while controlling the senses and mind, remaining unattached, rather than withdrawing from action with a deluded mind, thinking that just by sitting still and closing your eyes, that's the best way to make spiritual progress. Then this person says, these verses are relevant to my daily life because I often crave meditation, focusing on my mind in a static posture when I encounter stressful, desire-filled, or passionate states of mind during work. These verses clarify that inaction will not help. Instead, I should work while controlling my senses and mind with inner poise. Another person says, I find this helpful mainly to remain honest with myself. I would say it's mainly useful to not fall into self-deception. So I think this is common across a number of your responses. On a day-to-day basis, I'm not sure I really think of it this way, but just rather always be mindful of the thoughts that arise in my mind and know that these are passing rather than obsess over them. Okay. So we have a little time to address a few questions. Do you guys have any questions before I address online questions about any 3.1 to 3.7? No? Okay. Let me address a few online questions then. Geeta Stevens asks, in 3.3, what does yogi mean? Remember, karma yogena yoginam. Krishna taught karma yoga to yogis. Then she says, Geeta says, now this is confusing. There's Geeta the text and Geeta the lady, the devotee. Okay, Geeta the lady says, the devotee says, it seems like the context would include those who practice karma yoga and raja yoga. In America, people tend to use the word yogi for anyone doing Hindu spiritual practices like Patanjali type yoga, Hatha yoga, Jnana yoga, or bhakti. Only those who serve a great deal, like in soup kitchens for many hours a week, do not call themselves yogis. But when I was in India, it seemed to be used only for those who practice something like Raja yoga, pranayama, or Hatha yoga. Thakur Sri Ramakrishna seemed to use it that way also. I think it's a good question. I think, as I already kind of mentioned in the context of Bala's question, the same term can be used in completely different senses in different contexts in the Gita. So what does yoga mean? It depends on the context, on the particular verse. And yoga in chapter 5 in the beginning refers to karma yoga. And here it's also kind of a similar interpretation. Karma yogena yoginam. That means what? Yogis are those who are temperamentally suited for karma yoga. That's the way I would put it. Okay? Kelly is a new online participant from Ojai. She says, I have a question about the concept that has been discussed in this and prior talks about freedom from actions. I think she means naishkarmya. She says, I can see three aspects of this concept. One, being free from reactivity to the world, neither having aversion nor attraction to sense objects. Two, being free from the karmic consequences of actions. And three, once one is free from reactivity and the result of reactivity in action, one is not distracted by anything in the world or pulled into the world. Then one is able to rest in, merge in, submerge in, dissolve in the true nature of self. Do you see this as an accurate analysis that freedom of actions has multiple levels of meaning? I think that's a good reading of Shankara's interpretation of naishkarmya, I think. That there are different shades of meaning to the term. And one shade of meaning is that you cease from action. Another one is that you realize the actionless self. Padma asks, in Sri Ramakrishna's advice to Vidyasagar, he says, the activities that you are engaged in are good. It is very good if you can perform them in a selfless spirit, renouncing egoism, giving up the idea that you are the doer. Through such action, one develops love and devotion to God and ultimately realizes Him. And now Padma's question is Sri Ramakrishna saying that action with detachment can be a path to liberation by itself, or is it a preparatory step to developing bhakti and liberation? This is an interesting question. So I think another way of putting the question is Sri Ramakrishna supporting Shankara here? And I would say that one thing to keep in mind is, and this becomes more clear in the course of the Gita as we continue to read, karma yoga and bhakti yoga are not in airtight compartments. And that the way that Krishna teaches Arjuna to practice karma yoga is on the basis of bhakti. Chapter 9, Yat karoshi yadashnasi yadjuhoshi dadasiyat yat tapassi kaunteya tatkurushu madarpanam. Whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever actions you engage in, do them as an offering to me, as a worship of me. So it's karma yoga come bhakti yoga. It's a joint practice. That's the first thing. I think Sri Ramakrishna, when he's thinking of karma yoga, I think he's thinking of the same thing. So it's not that karma yoga is a feeder discipline for bhakti yoga, but that karma yoga itself, to do it properly, should be work dedicated to God. The negative side is trying to take ego and desire out of the work. The positive side is doing it for God and as an offering to God. Other questions? I mean, there are a lot of questions, but no? We're good? Okay, thanks. There's a lot here. So, as I said, I'll post the next assignment on the WhatsApp group and under the YouTube description. Thanks, everyone. The next class is in 2 weeks. Thanks for working so hard. Thanks for all the wonderful responses to your study questions. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.